guns, a furniture warehouse, and Abraham Lincoln. We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program about state government, politics, and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Mark Maxwell, Capitol Chief for WCIA Television. Welcome, Mark.
Bruce, thanks for having me.
Also, Mike Lawrence, Director Emeritus of the Simon Public Policy Institute. Welcome, Mr. Lawrence.
It's good to be here.
Thank you. Let's get right to it. I want to talk about this Barney's Furniture Warehouse issue that erupted some months ago and got hot again this week with the release of an Auditor General's report. Mark, you've been all over this issue from the beginning. You, in fact, broke the story several months ago about why this matters. Give us a primer on this, if you could.
Well, the State Journal Register was first to bring Senator Andy Minar's concerns to the public light that the cost was just too high at this warehouse, and so the building sold for $575,000 back in 2016. The owners of the building then turned around and promptly leased it to the state at a rate of $2.4 million over a 5-year span. So they're making far more, even with some of the upgrades that have happened at the building, than what they're spending on it. And the lease is just above market. It's a warehouse in sort of a not so great part of town. And anyways,
bottom line, they could have owned it for much less than they're spending.
The state could have. Well, the state didn't have to move the paper out of a warehouse, prison in Dwight. That facility where those papers used to sit now sits vacant, and the state could have fixed that property. Then the state could have bought the warehouse for much less. They didn't do that. They chose to lease it instead. And so we started looking into the money, and we said, well, who's behind this? And it took some length, some digging, but one of the 3 shell companies that owns that bought that building was registered to a guy named Rafi Vartanian. He turned out to be the son-in-law of Bill Cellini, who Springfield folks will recognize his name, the former king of clout before he before he went to jail in the Rod Blagojevich sting, and he still has. I believe he's somewhat detached now from Pacific Management and some other big leasing companies.
His family is owning it. Family owns it.
Yes, and there are some big, there are massive leasing contracts with the state where people inside the government have told me, you should look at the broader scope of all the leases, all the properties that the state just continually pays top dollar for when they could either own them, but then when the state goes in and owns a building, they're bad landlords, they don't keep them up. So there's this sort of, the state's paying a premium rate for all these buildings, and the people, the reason why this came back to light now was an audit found and really zeroed in on exactly how.
On the Capital Development Board or procurement process, who the Cellinis, you'd mentioned them, he played some sort of role there. He lives somewhat close to the Cellinis?
Well, right across the street. We referred to him as a next door neighbor, but he lives right across the street. His name is Frank Valla. He's appointed to the head of the Procurement Policy Board. This is a board that is supposed to approve or deny leases when they're above $100,000. These are watchdogs. And they're supposed to say this is wasteful spending or this is not a good idea. The audit sort of rebuked Mr. Valla for not having a conflict of interest policy in place. Valla told us in a report last year that in fact he knew this lease was going to his next door neighbor and lifelong friend's son-in-law and daughter. And he said he had known them all their life, and yet he did not recuse himself from that decision. In fact, they basically turned a blind eye, did not allow a vote at all, which in effect allowed that lease to pass. Supposed to submit to rationalize their lease was doctored. It was scrubbed. There were 2 versions. The first version would have set off alarm bells and would have said, wait, hang on, Valla and procurement board members, this lease is not a good deal. It shouldn't go through. But then a second version came out, presumably authored and edited or at least influenced by a guy named Chip Smith, who's also close to this little triumvirate group of Springfield insiders, if you will. He's the son of former Sangamon County Republican Party Chairman Art Smith, I believe his name was. Irv Smith, you're right. Yeah, Irv Smith.
There you go.
And Chip.
Familiar names to a lot of our viewers. Go ahead.
Right, and so Chip was the leasing agent who signed the lease deal and negotiated the lease deals. And then I'm told he also had influence on changing that one document to this other one. But the Rauner administration has not said whether or not anybody has been fired or disciplined. There's just right now really radio silence from the administration as they sort of comb through this audit and see what it means.
We've got this thing from the Auditor General that says documents were altered, that there was a conflict of interest, that a person whose family stood to benefit lives across the street from somebody who played a role in the decision.
Yeah, the audit didn't. The audit actually said they found no evidence. And the Auditor Generals are pretty corralled into what they can actually investigate in private persons.
Okay.
They have to follow state money.
Sure.
They said they found but they don't have any kind of subpoena power to go after emails or phone calls or any other records. So they just did interviews.
Okay.
And from what they got in interviews with Mr. Valla, they said they found no evidence that a personal relationship played a role. But the rest of us that have done reporting outside of the scope of the Auditor General have been able to put more together and give us a fuller picture of what happened.
Okay, apologies to Mr. Valla then. What's the next step here? I mean, is there going to be a next step? Mr. McSweeney has expressed some concerns. The comptroller cut off payments to this for this lease a number of months ago, did she not?
She did. She says she's reviewing it. It was actually a really interesting legal question because the chief procurement officer, Ellen Daly, has said they actually disagreed with the findings of the Auditor General and said this was above. There's nothing we did wrong here.
Okay.
That's the person who has the power to nix a lease. So if the comptroller says we're just not going to pay it, and the vendor says we have a legally signed contract that we fulfilled, we delivered the goods, there could be a court fight coming.
Okay.
Senator Tom Cullerton and Representative David McSweeney, and to a lesser degree, Senator Andy Menard said he would invite an investigation from the from the Attorney General.
Okay.
Perhaps a criminal investigation if there are any private people or any other relationships involved in steering the state contracts to people they knew and were related to.
I'm not aware of Madigan's office weighing in at this point. Is that?
They are aware of the requests to look into it. I don't believe there's been an official letter. This is just public statements from the elected officials asking for her and her office to look into it. She's aware of that request, but at this point, I have no reason to believe that she will investigate. Okay.
And lastly, I mean, there's a local level too. I believe someone had raised the specter. Where's the state's attorney? Is there anybody been asking that question?
That's a good question.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Moving along to the other big news this week. Let's talk about guns for a second. The governor has vetoed a gun measure. It looks like there's something in it for just about everybody. I mean, the initial one would have altered the waiting period when buying firearms. This would have expanded it to all firearms from, I believe, just handguns. Engendered in this is not just controls on guns, but also an expansion of the death penalty. How's that flying?
Well, when you say there's something for everybody, that's true. But the other side of this is there's also something for certain groups to oppose in it as well. But it, I think it was pretty transparently a political ploy by Governor Rauner. Aside from whether it's good policy or not, I'm sure or confident that his private polling drove some of this, looking at the public's views on death penalty, particularly among conservatives, and he's had problems with conservatives, had a pretty vigorous primary challenge from the most conservative part of the Republican Party. So this is a way to try to win them back. At the same time, what he did on the other side of this, this was a bill to extend the waiting period on purchasing assault weapons. He broadened it to cover all weapons, which is an appeal to the gun control people. Now, now you'll have the gun rights people, I would assume, fairly upset with him in fighting it. And on the death penalty side of it, he may have conservatives, the most conservatives, Republicans, thinking, well, maybe there's some redemption here for him. But at the same time, one of the groups that Rauner needs to do well in to have a chance of winning re-election are Republican women in the suburbs. And I'm not sure they're big fans of the death penalty at this point, particularly given Illinois' history with the death penalty, where there have been a lot of mistakes and false convictions in death penalty cases.
Yeah, it seems kind of as if he's almost defining in some way what a conservative is, that death penalty, I'll get more votes rather than go with the gun control, and conservatives are known for supporting or actually for opposing gun control measures.
Well, it's interesting. The governor had a number of clarifications and responses, reactions to questions this week that give us even a better idea of where exactly he's trying to thread this needle. First, he's saying the death penalty for cop killers and mass murderers only. And he's saying it's only for people that can be proved beyond all doubt, which is a different legal distinction than beyond reasonable doubt, but it's still questionable exactly how much that is. For example, Senator Kwame Raoul opposes this idea because he says, look, when you have coerced confessions, even with a videotaped interrogation, where a person says, look, I did it, and we've had that in Illinois where DNA evidence later came out and said, no, they didn't. Something must have happened off camera, Raoul said, where this person was put in a spot where they confessed to something, and every juror at that case thought beyond all doubt, he said it with his own words, he must have done it. Rauner says, no, that's not the case. This is only for cases where 100 people saw him do it, and they drove a vehicle into a crowd, or they opened fire at a school, and there's video evidence, and everybody knows this person did it. So he's trying to say this is only for the worst of the worst. And House Republican leader Jim Durkin and Governor Rauner, both of them stopped short of saying this would actually deter mass shootings or people from shooting at law enforcement officers. They said it's not really about that so much, in so many words, but it's more about restoring respect for law enforcement and really changing the way the culture looks at police. And so they're trying to score points with a big middle of America that feels that police have been under the thumb of sort of the cultural left in a way.
I'm not sure if there's an example in American jurisprudence of the standard being all doubt. I mean, has anybody looked into that? Or, I mean, because it's reasonable doubt, which is the highest standard now available in the court system, as opposed to preponderance or clear and convincing. Has anybody anywhere used all doubt as the standard?
I don't know the answer to that, but the Rauner administration has said that they are on firm legal standing. They've consulted with attorneys, and that this is not anything new. Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker, the most popular governor in America, just recently also did something very similar in that state.
Well, I think it would be pretty difficult if it did become law. It would be very difficult to implement, and I think it also, one of the arguments for eliminating the death penalty was the cost of it. And if it is put into effect, you're talking about, tens of millions of dollars that will have to be reestablished, because the death penalty requires certain protections for the defendant. You set up a series of appeals with the courts. So Illinois and some other states spent years and years debating the death penalty, and after that long debate, which was influenced in Illinois by cases that turned out that people were wrongly convicted, Illinois made a decision to do away with the death penalty. I think that history indicates that nothing should be done quickly, in the way of restoring that penalty if it's done at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think one point that folks should remember, I would think, is that the juries that convicted those folks, those 13 defendants who were later exonerated, and the judges who played a role in that process, I'm pretty darn sure were pretty convinced that they were guilty. I mean, whether the standard was reasonable, which is under the law, or all. I mean, you don't convict somebody, I think, knowing that their lives are at stake without being clear to almost the nth degree that you're convinced.
Yeah, and if you're a defense attorney, when we did have the death penalty in Illinois, if the case went to trial, they pushed and pushed on creating a reasonable doubt. And I think if you're in the courtroom where the standard is any doubt, that is going to be a very tough standard for the prosecution to meet. So then I mean, this is all speculation, but you would probably have fewer convictions. You'd have more time between the actual event and the execution, and you'd create public cynicism, or add to it, about the judicial system. So even though there are people who strongly believe in the death penalty, and I respect their views, I think you have to look at the ramifications of restoring it.
There's a bit of legislative savvy here, I think, too, not just in politics and how it sets up in positions for the election, but for how it really changes the debate on the floor of the House. This started off, like you said, as a bill to only extend a waiting period, a 72-hour cooling off period, to assault weapons. It also defined and changed the definition of what is an assault weapon. That's a bit of an uncomfortable bill for many pro-gun conservatives. So, but it was still a bill that people kind of disliked or kind of liked. It wasn't like a clear, silver bullet, to use a bad pun, in the gun control issue. Governor Rauner upped the ante to a tremendous degree because he said, we're going to throw in the death penalty for cop killers and mass murderers, but by the way, we're also going to ban bump stocks and trigger cranks, and we're going to do a bunch of other things around the spectrum, and he added all those big things into a big sort of what he called a public safety bill.
An omnibus sort of thing.
If there was any spending involved, certainly, and then he sent it over, and Speaker Madigan, not one to really back down from a salivating, interesting fight, he accepted it. His representative, Jonathan Carroll, said, we're going to go ahead and put this bill out for full debate. We're going to air it out. And I don't think the Republicans were really anticipating that. They thought the Democrats were just going to walk away from it.
Yeah.
But now, starting Monday, there's going to be a big open hearing about all these issues. And there will be a lot of people, interested parties, in the room to debate whether or not the state should reinstate the death penalty.
I think you're right. It is fascinating because it has the specter of now all of this is out on the table. I mean, as you say, we started with 72 hours for assault rifles. Now pretty much the whole buffet of gun control stuff is.
And it puts conservatives in this box a little bit because they can say, ooh, I love the idea of saying I'm with police, but oh man, I've got to compromise and put up with the ban on bump stocks. Like some like C.D. Davidsmeyer is an example. He's a Republican downstate who would not vote to ban a bump stock. But now he might be at least a little more tempted to do so. So this is one example of how this is drawing people in to look at this idea.
Do you think it's going to come to a vote this year?
No, I don't believe it's going to come to a vote. Yeah. The bill, well, I'll just say, I'll say sources who are close to this process feel that the strategy here is to basically make the governor eat his words. Put this on full display and then trot out a bunch of experts who will all come in and unanimously condemn the idea of the death penalty. So you might say it's DOA, it's dead on arrival, this whole idea, but we don't know that yet. We really don't know because at the end of the day, if I think the way they refiled it back as an amendment goes back to Rules Committee, so they can have a subject matter hearing without ever advancing it out of rules, and it could just die off there.
Well, a good part of this is political maneuvering by the governor and I think by the speaker. The governor used a mandatory veto power to rewrite this bill. I think it clearly went beyond the bounds of what the framers of the Constitution meant when they put that, or intended when they put that mandatory veto power in there. And the Speaker typically rules that the governor's abused the power, and that's it. I don't think he wanted a headline that said governor rejects, either any element of this bill. This way, he puts it on another bill, or at least contemplates doing that. The AV, I don't think they're going to end up voting on. Maybe they are. I know there's been a motion to accept it. But this way, it avoids a runner commercial saying Madigan killed, and he can pick any part of this bill that he wants to highlight as Madigan killing it. He's not going to kill it. He's going to hold a hearing on it, but not likely will there be a vote before the election this fall.
Yeah, the constitutionality of the mandatory veto is one of these wonky debates inside the legislature and the State House, but really it's a reluctance on the part of the Speaker to give the governor that kind of power. The governor says, well, sometimes my AVs reappear as new bills, but only parts of them. So the governor kind of walked in saying, I expect them to reject this on that ground, so I might as well just inject a big old piece of red meat to my base in the middle of it.
It almost sounds, to use a bad football metaphor, that they've both punted and the hang time on this one is so high there's not going to be a return started until after Election Day.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, well, if that's the case, what do you say to folks who, and I've been in schools before, I was in Southeast High School a number of months ago, reporting on something completely different. They had what they'd called a soft lockdown, and I didn't know what that meant. And the teacher I was interviewing said, oh, we have these occasionally. It means that there's some danger outside the school lurking. And so everybody has to remain where they are until the all clear sounds. And that's when it brought it home for me personally. Kids are going to school in this kind of an atmosphere. And so you've got these gun tragedies that are happening all across the nation, and not a lot has happened. And so here in Illinois, at least, it's turned into a political issue where it seems there's a chance that nothing is going to be resolved. They tried to make things better by this degree, depending on your point of view, and they don't seem to be moving the ball very quickly.
Well, speaking about school issues, there was a hero in Dixon this week.
Sure, absolutely.
In Dixon, Illinois, a school resource officer who stepped up and I believe shot a would-be assailant.
The assailant would agree he was shot, yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure. I didn't know if there was some other means of apprehension, but it was just interesting in Springfield because people were looking at. There was a recent debate by some House Democrats, and the first bill filed said we want to strip funding and block funding from going to school resource officers. We don't believe school resource officers actually do anything to protect schools, and we want to take that money and divert it into mental health resources instead. Yeah. One of the sponsors of that bill, as it was now, it's been since changed to soften some of the language, but one of the first sponsors on that bill was J.B. Pritzker's running mate Juliana Stratton. And I asked him, I said, after what happened in Dixon, do you still believe that school resource officers don't have any impact on school safety? And they said, well, we believe mental health and all these things. And they kind of gave this sort of watered down statement without actually answering the question. So there is actually a debate right now about what to do, not just in the public with guns, but at schools, and that's one of them.
Sure. Let's talk about very quickly, if we could. There's been a plea. There's now a GoFundMe campaign that's been launched by the Abraham Presidential Library Foundation, the nonprofit foundation that supports the Presidential Library and Museum. How much concern is there in the legislature about this? The foundation is saying that if they can't get sufficient funds, then relics might have to be put on the auction block. Is there a palpable sense of crisis yet?
No.
Okay.
There are a few people locally who think it's just it's one of those things that is bad for optics. The legislature doesn't feel obligated to intervene at all.
Okay.
The governor's office is reluctant to do so and says basically they can figure it out.
Okay.
But they're coming to, the Lincoln Library is coming to the governor's office hat in hand, if you will, and saying, help us out. And right now, I I briefly understand there's like a tangled weave of interests in the organization there with the way the debt is, and some of the relics were acquired, and so it's not just an easy fix, but the State House doesn't feel that it's really up to them to save Lincoln's hat.
Okay. And so is that something that, I mean, the debt comes due in October of 2019. The governor said there's plenty of time to get it together. The foundation had said we've gone to the legislature twice, General Assembly, asking for money. Has anybody seen any evidence of that? I wasn't aware of any bill ever having been introduced is anybody, where's it coming from?
You actually do have sales. It's going to be an embarrassment for the state. The land in Lincoln, not able to keep, important Lincoln documents. And one of the best suggestions I heard on this actually came from Charlie Wheeler, who's familiar to viewers of CapitolView. And he suggested that Rauner and Pritzker suspend their advertising for just a month or two, and the money they would put into that would be enough to get the loan repaid.
See, I thought Charlie would have suggested that both of them would actually advantage or benefit from the narrative, that Rauner would say, look, the out-migration swept up even Lincoln's and Pritzker could say Rauner's budget crisis sent Lincoln even further into the grave.
But they both, as we well know, you have a multi-billionaire and a near billionaire, and they're throwing their own money into these commercials, which we're all going to be sick of sooner than later. And it was a tongue-in-cheek proposal, but I got a charge out of it.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, and very quickly before we go, we do have just 1 minute. The Republican Party has reached an agreement on who's going to chair the party. This feared or perhaps rumored about or suspected or will it happen fight for control of the Republican Party has been resolved amicably, at least on the surface. Does that help Rauner at all in terms of dealing with the conservative element?
It removes an embarrassing court fight and a battle where Jeannie Ives could continue her sort of insurgent attack from the right, but at least for now, the Republican Party seems to have split a power sharing deal. Okay, good enough. And with that, that's all the time we have. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next week on Capitol View.